My world shattered the moment I heard the voices in that car. But before I can explain the devastation of that day, I must take you back to where my story truly began. My name is Lydia. I am 62 years old, and my life has been a tapestry woven with sacrifice, hardship, and a love so fierce it became both my salvation and, in the cruelest twist, my undoing. It was a warm afternoon when I decided to surprise my son Javier with his favorite dessert. I had baked a chocolate cake, the same one he adored as a boy, and carried it to his office parking lot, hoping to brighten his day. I never imagined that small gesture of affection would lead me into the shadows of his darkest intentions. When I spotted his silver sedan parked alone, a playful idea crept into my mind. I would slip into the back seat and wait for him, then leap out with the cake in my hands, laughing at his surprise. The car was unlocked, almost as if fate itself had invited me inside. I crouched down behind the front seats, heart fluttering like a schoolgirl, picturing his delighted face when I revealed myself. The minutes dragged in silence until I heard footsteps. The driver's door opened, and Javier slid in his familiar cologne, filling the car. I almost giggled at the anticipation, but before I could move, another door clicked. A woman entered the passenger seat. At first, I thought it was a colleague until I heard the voice I knew all too well, Raquel, his wife. My smile softened into fondness. How sweet I thought they would leave work together. But then her words struck like knives. "Are you absolutely sure no one will suspect anything when it happens?" She asked, her tone icy, devoid of love. Javier's reply froze my blood. "We've gone over this 1,000 times. The plan is perfect. Mom will have a very natural, very believable accident. No one questions it when a woman her age slips on the stairs in that old house." I stopped breathing. My son, my only son, the boy I had raised alone after his father's sudden death, was calmly planning my murder. Raquel leaned closer, her voice quivering with excitement. "And after the funeral, once everything calms down, we can sell the house. That place is worth at least $200,000, and with her savings, we'll finally have the life we deserve." The words washed over me like acid. That old house was the shrine of my sacrifices, every corner etched with memories, nights spent nursing Javier through fevers, birthdays celebrated with homemade decorations because money was scarce, evenings spent teaching him multiplication at the worn kitchen table. And now, those walls were nothing more than currency for him and his wife. Then Javier asked about Alvin and Patricia, my brother and his wife. When Raquel confirmed their involvement, the last fragile string inside me snapped. I had trusted my brother, leaned on him in times of despair, and now he too had joined the plot to erase me. "Your uncle is desperate since he lost his job," Raquel continued coldly. "Patricia says your mother's always been stingy. She says it's time the family finally gets what it deserves." Stingy. That word clanged in my mind with cruel irony. I had scrubbed floors and washed toilets from the age of 18, my hands cracked from chemicals, my back bent from endless labor so that Javier could live with dignity. I had pawned my wedding ring, the last memory of Robert, my late husband, to buy Javier the computer he needed for school. I had eaten stale bread so he could have fresh fruit, worn old dresses so he could attend parties without shame. And now to them, I was nothing but a miser hoarding treasures they believed were theirs by right. The conversation in the car stretched on like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. They detailed the timing, the staged grief they would perform at my funeral, the way they would collect life insurance as though cashing in a lottery ticket. I huddled in the shadows of the back seat, tears sliding silently down my cheeks, my body trembling with a sadness too vast to contain. By the time they left, laughing lightly, as though nothing had been discussed, The woman who emerged from that car was no longer the same. The trusting mother, the forgiving sister, the woman who believed love could conquer hardship, she had died in those shadows. I drove home, numb, my mind replaying every word, every cold chuckle. My son, the reason I had endured decades of poverty and exhaustion, wanted me dead. To make sense of this betrayal, you must understand the road that brought us here, the story of a mother who gave everything to a child who grew up to value money above her life. Javier was born 35 years ago in the small bedroom of our modest house. His father, Robert, was a construction worker with rough hands and a gentle smile. We had little, but his presence gave me courage. That courage was ripped away when Robert died in a scaffolding accident, leaving me a widow at 27 with an 8-year-old son and nothing but debts. Overnight, I became both mother and father, protector and provider, with no safety net but the will inside me. I found work cleaning offices at dawn houses in the afternoon and sometimes a veterinary clinic at night. My body ached constantly, my fingers swollen, but every evening I tucked Javier into bed and whispered promises that he would have the life I never did. His teachers praised him as a bright student, destined for more than the limits of our neighborhood. Those words became my mission. Every dollar I earned went into an envelope marked college. When Javier turned 15, he needed a computer for his studies. For me, the cost was 3 months of wages. Quietly, I sold the only jewelry I owned, my wedding ring. I told Javier the money came from extra hours of work. He never knew, and I never wanted him to feel the weight of that sacrifice. By his senior year, university brochures filled our mailbox. Javier dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Tuition was $20,000 a year, a mountain higher than any I had ever climbed. I swallowed my pride and went to Alvin for help. My brother, secure in his insurance job, laughed in my face. "Why should I risk my savings on your boy's fantasies? He should get a job and forget about those impossible dreams." His cruelty scarred me, but it didn't stop me. I took on a second job, working nearly 16 hours a day. I cooked tamales and empanadas on weekends to sell in the market. I wore secondhand shoes until the soles peeled off. And somehow, I scraped together enough for Javier's first year. The day he signed his enrollment papers, I cried tears of triumph. He walked across campus with his head high, unaware that his mother had mortgaged her very health to place him there. Those years nearly broke me. I ate 1 meal a day, so he would never feel hunger. I sewed his clothes late at night so he wouldn't be mocked for poverty. When he called home excited about debates in moot court, I smiled through my exhaustion. "Study hard, son. Your only job is to study," I told him. During his junior year, he met Raquel. She was beautiful, elegant, the daughter of wealthy parents who owned businesses and vacation homes. I worried Javier would feel inferior, but he glowed in her presence. She visited our home once, her eyes sweeping critically over my worn furniture and peeling paint. She smiled politely, but her disdain was written in every raised eyebrow. I told myself it was nerves that she would learn to see me as family. I was wrong. When Javier graduated, I thought the storm had passed. He secured a job at a prestigious law firm, earning more than I had ever dreamed. His wedding to Raquel was lavish, a ceremony that drained my last savings, because I wanted him to feel proud, not ashamed of his roots. I stood in the back as guests whispered about the groom's humble mother, swallowing my humiliation. After marriage, Javier visited less often. Raquel's excuses piled up: business dinners, vacations, gatherings with her parents. When they did come, conversation revolved around their luxury apartment, fine dining, their dream of buying a $500,000 home. They began asking subtle questions: how much was my house worth? Had I updated my will? Did I have life insurance? At the time, I thought it was concern. Now I know it was calculation. Meanwhile, Alvin grew bitter, mocking me for having a successful son while his children stumbled through life. Patricia sneered that I had spent everything on Javier while neglecting the rest of the family. Their resentment simmered, feeding the conspiracy that would one day consume us all. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Javier's condescending tone when he spoke to me, the way Raquel's eyes lit up when money was mentioned, Alvin's jealousy, Patricia's cutting remarks. I ignored them, blinded by the love of a mother who could not imagine her child wishing her dead. But that day in the car stripped away all illusions. When I stumbled into my kitchen that night, I stared at the walls that had once been my fortress and realized they were nothing but traps in the eyes of my family. The very roof I had sacrificed to maintain had become the bait for my murder. I lay in bed sleepless, the echo of Raquel's cold voice replaying endlessly, Javier's calm tone rehearsing my accident like a line in a play. By dawn, I understood the truth. Love had not protected me. Sacrifice had not saved me. I was prey, and the hunters were my own blood. But if they thought I would crumble quietly, they were wrong. I had survived widowhood, poverty, and decades of toil. I could survive betrayal too. The days after I overheard that conversation were a haze of disbelief and suffocating silence. Every creak in the house felt like an omen. Every phone call from Javier, a rehearsal for my funeral. I walked through the rooms of my home, touching the photographs on the walls, running my hand over the worn banister of the staircase they had chosen as my execution stage. I looked at the loose rug at the top of the stairs, suddenly seeing it not as a household annoyance, but as a weapon. How many times had Javier stood right there, eyes calculating, pretending concern, while imagining me tumbling to my death? I tried to cling to fragments of normal life. I watered my plants, folded laundry, stirred pots of soup, as if nothing had changed. But inside, my heart thudded with dread. I could not shake the image of my son's voice coldly detailing the plan, Raquel's laughter dripping with contempt. When I tried to pray at night, my words stuck in my throat. How do you pray for a child plotting your death? How do you ask God to spare him when his hands are already reaching to push you into the grave? 3 days after the car, Javier called with forced cheer. Mom, Raquel and I want to take you to dinner. It's been too long since we had a nice evening together. Wear that green dress you love, you'll look wonderful. His voice was honeyed, but I heard the bitterness underneath. Why specify the green dress? What did it matter what I wore if it was meant to be my last supper? That Friday evening, I dressed carefully, staring at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. Same silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, same careful makeup, but the eyes were harder, darker. I whispered to her reflection, "This may be your final night. Don't let them see your fear." Javier and Raquel arrived right on time. He kissed my cheek with exaggerated affection. Raquel's smile was too wide, too polished, as if rehearsed. On the drive to the restaurant, their conversation was oddly stilted, filled with meaningless chatter about the weather and vacation plans. My replies were automatic, but every nerve in my body was tuned to catch their true intentions. At the restaurant, Raquel insisted I order the most expensive dish, praising me with cloying sweetness. "You deserve it, Lydia. Don't worry about the cost, we want you to enjoy yourself." She reached across the table to pat my hand, her perfectly manicured nails sharp against my skin. Javier leaned in, his tone suddenly earnest. "Mom, how have you been feeling lately? Any dizziness? Trouble climbing the stairs? You should be careful in that old house." I forced a laugh. "I've lived there 30 years, son. I know those stairs like the back of my hand." "Accidents don't care how long we've lived somewhere," Raquel added smoothly. "Maybe you should consider moving to a single-story place. It would be safer." The word accident slid from her tongue like poison, They pressed further, pretending concern, but circling the subject like vultures. "Have you updated your will recently?" Javier asked, lowering his voice as if it were an act of discretion. "It's important to have everything in order. Laws change. I could help you review it, make sure your wishes are respected." My chest tightened. The very son plotting my death wanted to write the legal script of my estate. I smiled weakly, answering, "Don't worry, everything is arranged. Of course, everything goes to you." Their eyes flickered with satisfaction, that hungry glint impossible to disguise. After dinner, they insisted on walking me into the house. Javier held my arm like a dutiful son. "Be careful, Mom. These stairs are dark. You could fall." Raquel wandered the rooms, pointing out the dangers. "This rug is loose. This banister is shaky. You really should think about better lighting." Their eyes scanned every corner, not with love, but with the precision of architects designing my demise. When they finally left, my house felt violated, the air thick with the echo of their deceit. That night, I sat awake until dawn, trembling with the knowledge that time was running out. They had inspected the crime scene. Soon they would act. I had two choices: wait to die or fight back. And if I was going to fight, I would need evidence. So, I began to spy. It felt grotesque watching my own child from the shadows, but necessity left no room for hesitation. I parked discreetly near their apartment, followed them from a distance, listened closely whenever they called. What I discovered chilled me further. Their lifestyle far exceeded their income. Javier earned well as a lawyer, but Raquel no longer worked. They dined in restaurants where a single meal cost more than my weekly groceries. She bought designer handbags as if they were candy. Their rent alone was more than half his salary. Soon, I overheard a heated call, Javier arguing with the bank about overdue payments. $50,000 in credit card debt loans piling interest daily. Their dream life was a collapsing house of cards, and I was the foundation they planned to steal. Worse still, Alvin and Patricia were in deeper than I feared. One afternoon, while cleaning near Patricia's office, I overheard her hissing into the phone. "Alvin's right. It's time Lydia's money served someone else. That stingy woman won't last forever. Why wait?" My knees nearly buckled. My own brother had lost his job, and instead of asking for help, he chose to plot my death. That night, I went to his house. When he opened the door, guilt flickered across his face like lightning. "Is it true?" I asked bluntly. "Did you lose your job?" Alvin stammered. "How did you?" But Patricia cut in coldly. "Yes. And while you sit on your savings, we're drowning. You've always cared only for Javier, never for us." Her venom spewed years of resentment. "When Alvin needed money for his kids, you said no. But for Javier, there was always more. You think you're better than us, Lydia, because your son made it." I stared at them in disbelief. Everything I gave Javier, I earned with my blood. Do you think it was easy I starved so he could study? I sold my wedding ring so he could learn. That isn't favoritism, that's sacrifice. But Alvin's eyes were hard. Sacrifice or selfishness. You built your little kingdom on suffering, and now you hoard it while we sink. That money should have been shared long ago. They knew the exact value of my accounts, my house, my life insurance. My breath caught. "How do you know these numbers?" I whispered. Their silence was all the answer I needed. They had investigated every corner of my finances. I left their house shaking the truth undeniable. It wasn't just Javier and Raquel. My brother and his wife were in it too. My whole family was a conspiracy. The following days were darker than any widowhood, darker than any hunger. I carried the knowledge that people who bore my blood wished me dead, and there was no one I could tell. Who would believe me if I said my son wanted to kill me? Who would take the word of an old woman against a respectable lawyer and his polished wife? I needed proof ironclad and undeniable. So I documented everything. I wrote down times, dates, words. I began carrying a small recorder in my purse. I cataloged their visits, their suspicious kindness, their probing questions, and all the while I smiled and played the naive mother. I let them believe they were winning. If I flinched, if I confronted them too soon, they would change tactics, perhaps act quickly and violently. Better to let them think I was still blind. 3 days after confronting Alvin, Javier called again. Mom, Raquel and I want to see you this weekend. Dinner again. Just the 3 of us. His tone was syrupy, practiced. My stomach clenched. Was this the night they would act? I forced a cheerful yes. The charade continued. At dinner, they asked again about my health, about wills, about stair accidents. They insisted on helping me into the house, commenting on the lighting, the rug, the railing. I smiled, thanked them, closed the door, and locked it tight behind them, collapsing into sobs. That night, I made my decision. If they wanted me to have an accident, then that's exactly what I would give them. But it would be on my terms. I would fake my own death. It was the most terrifying plan I had ever conceived. I lay awake, sketching it out in my mind, how to make it convincing, how to control the details, how to gather evidence while the wolves thought they had finally eaten me. I knew I couldn't do it alone. There was only one person I trusted, my neighbor and dearest friend, Beatrice. Beatrice was 70, a retired nurse, tough as iron with a heart of gold. She had held my hand through Robert's funeral, brought soup when I was sick, and never once judged my poverty. The next morning, I went to her house, trembling. When she opened the door and saw my face, her smile vanished. Lydia, what's wrong? I sat at her kitchen table, the familiar smell of coffee surrounding me, and spilled everything. The car, the dinner, Alvin's venom, the loose rug, the life insurance. By the end, Beatrice's hands were gripping mine, her eyes blazing. My God, Lydia, this is monstrous. Beatrice shook her head in disbelief. Do you realize what you're saying? Do you know how dangerous it is? I know, I said, but if I wait, they'll succeed. I have no choice. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she exhaled sharply. All right, if you're determined, then we'll do it safely. I'll help you, but we must plan every detail perfectly. And so began the strangest days of my life, planning my own death with the precision of a military operation. Beatrice used her hospital contacts to discreetly gather what we needed: medication to lower my vitals, the cooperation of an old colleague in the morgue, a sympathetic pathologist. We rehearsed scenarios, discussed risks, tested the equipment. She insisted on meticulous safety measures to ensure I would not actually die. It was terrifying. Yet with every plan we sketched, I felt a strange empowerment blooming inside me. They thought I was weak, helpless, one step away from the grave. They had no idea I was preparing to rise from death itself, not as prey, but as the judge of their betrayal. The night before we acted, I hardly slept. Beatrice came over with a satchel of carefully labeled vials, notebooks full of timing charts, and a small pulse oximeter she insisted I wear during practice runs. We reviewed contingencies like surgeons reviewing a risky operation. If anything went wrong, our backup plan was to call an ambulance and have Beatrice present as the distraught neighbor who had found me. We rehearsed what she would say, how she would cradle my head and call 911, how she would weep convincingly in front of the paramedics. It felt theatrical and sacramental. At once we were staging my death, so truth could be born out of that false ending. When my hands trembled with fear, Beatrice took them and reminded me why we had to do this. They plan to bury you like a secret, she said. We'll make them bury their guilt with you. But first, we'll lay their corruption bare. Her confidence bolstered me more than any sleep would have. Early Sunday afternoon, we set the scene. I wore a simple dress, one of the nicer things in my closet I never wanted to waste, and Beatrice arranged the living room exactly as though I had simply collapsed while dusting the mantel. She placed the phone on speaker out of sight and dialed 911 when the moment came, using the practiced voice they had rehearsed until every inflection sounded natural. As the drugs took effect, the world seemed to slide away into a slow, muffled film. My lungs felt distant and small, a whisper of motion. Beatrice placed me gently on the floor and began her lines with a credibility that would have fooled a jury. I found her like this. She was just there on the rug. I thought, oh God, I thought she was gone. The sirens were a dreadful kind of music, drawing the medical crew in with efficient violence. From the half-world I inhabited, I heard the paramedics' brisk commands, the clipping of gloves, the rustle of equipment. Nothing. No pulse, no respirations, one said. She's gone. The word gone landed like a gavel. They worked calmly, and when the lead medic pronounced death, it felt like a ceremonial bell. I was declared dead at the scene. My legal life ended as 2 paramedics folded a sheet over me and carried me out. For some reason, my chest empty as it was felt lighter. We had pulled the final cord on the trap. I woke later, the drugs ebbing like a tide in the basement of Beatrice's house. It was like surfacing for air after drowning everything bright, cruelly real. Beatrice's face hovered above me, weary and triumphant. On the table next to us sat her laptop loaded with recordings. We had played the call we'd made to Javier through her phone, the voice that would set the gears of his hidden plan in motion. Beatrice's radio voice conveyed the shocked neighbor. Hers had always been the voice of kindness, so it sounded authentic even to me. Later that night, as she replayed the call, Javier's reply chilled me all over again. He said the right words: shock haste, grieving arrangements, warm, rehearsed grief. He and Raquel spoke in the clipped tones of people who had been waiting for this currency to arrive. That same night, while I lay hidden, Beatrice installed a few more covert cameras in the house, small lenses tucked where only the light and dust would notice them. We had to catch their faces, their bargaining, their indifference. We wanted not only words, but gestures, how they touched my jewelry box, the way they measured my mantle like appraisers. We wanted to prove that they had not merely spoken callous thoughts in private, but had acted as if my death were already a ledger to be balanced. The morning the family gathered should have been quiet and solemn. Instead, I watched through Beatrice's screens as they arrived, not in sorrow, but in stealthy practicality. A cloudless day seemed indecent, as if even the sky refused to mourn. They hugged quickly, faces strained with the performance of grief, then moved through the house like scavengers. I wanted to run to the door, fling it open, scream. But we were not ready. The evidence had to be collected, and so I watched them rifle through my life folders, drawers, the old cereal boxes where I had kept receipts, and saw greed in the small, precise movements of their fingers. Patricia laughed at a faded photograph. Alvin tossed family heirlooms into a pile for appraisal. Raquel adjusted candle arrangements as if planning a catalog shoot. Javier tracked the documents with an efficiency I had once admired in him when he prepared moot court briefs. Now that same competence felt like a blade. When they found the life insurance policy, their faces changed in that microsecond that granted me the final proof I needed. It was the moment vultures become bankers, practical, cold, immediate. That afternoon, they convened what they called a family meeting in my living room to discuss distribution. My house concentrated every memory of a lifetime into the parquet floorboards, and in that space, they performed arithmetic. Beatrice and I watched every exchange in taut silence. We recorded their voices, captured their laughter, preserved the precise phrase Patricia used, "I didn't think it would take this long," which would later hang around her neck like a noose. I felt a fury then that was sharp and disciplined. Not blind, not hysterical, but a precise recognition that this betrayal had to be contained and exposed. After hours of pillaging, they left with boxes and triumphant little notes in their hands. They were confident of victory. That evening, Beatrice and I reviewed the harvest of evidence. Hidden cameras recorded phone calls, a trail of messages between Raquel and a lender suggesting financial desperation. Receipts showing Raquel's purchases. Alvin's screenshots boasting about the imminent windfall. We had more than words, we had the map of their conspiracy. But going public would not be easy. The law can be kind to the privileged, and these were polished people with polished lawyers. We needed a platform that would not be brushed off as an elderly woman's vendetta. I had one more unlikely ally, Maria Elena, an investigative reporter who had once covered a story about elderly fraud and had been moved by my op-ed letter to the local paper months before. I called her with a voice that did not tremble. "Maria Elena. I need you to listen without judging," I said. She came within 48 hours, her curiosity cleaved to a journalist's hunger. When we unfolded our case recordings cameras, the story of the staged funeral planning, her eyes changed in that exact way I had seen only when television news uncovers corruption. "If this holds up," she said quietly, "this is the sort of expose that blows open small-town facades. But we do this right, documented chain of custody, legal consultation, coordinated release. People will try to silence you." The way she spoke the word we stitched together, the final measure of courage I needed. The week that followed blurred with interviews, legal appointments, and the most surreal task of all, attending my own wake. They had arranged a small memorial, a low-key cremation service as Javier had advised. The day they carried my lifeless form out of the hospital, I sat with Beatrice in the cafe 2 blocks away and watched the parade of mourners. Friends who had been true, Mrs. Alvarez from the church, my former student Maria, who had come back to say thanks, moved through grief with soft, honest sorrow. They were the unaffected notes in this symphony of deceit. Javier and Raquel arrived supposedly to pay respects, and their faces were masks worn so well, it sent a chill up my spine. Patricia and Alvin were already there, their expressions, dutiful eyes, flicking to the exit, as if an appraisal might come at any second. When they spoke to friends, their stories were polished. It was sudden, the doctors said, a fragile heart so unexpected. Not once did anyone suspect the story we were hiding. On the day of the supposed burial, the small chapel was dim with flowers. People had left most for a mother who had truly loved. The priest spoke kindly of charity and sacrifice. I felt like an actor at the play's most loaded scene, the audience weeping for a role I had never truly played. But while they sang and folded their napkins with servantly precision, Beatrice and I were at the back of the hall, phones loaded and ready. The next act would be humiliation, but the only justice I wanted was truth. We coordinated with Maria Elena and the local authorities. She had a team and a plan, a live sting-timed legal counsel prepped to move immediately when the evidence was aired. The next Saturday, a family meeting was again arranged at my house, this time under the pretext of dividing heirlooms. They thought it routine, a final tidy. I walked into the house at 3:15, accompanied not by sorrow, but by 2 camera crews, a reporter whose eyes were fierce with conviction, and 2 police officers in plain clothes. The scene we had staged felt both theatrical and righteous. We had rehearsed the moment precisely, how I would open the door, how Javier would drop his documents, how guilt would show on their faces like a storm cloud. I turned the knob and walked into the living room where they sat, suits crease-lined, voices low and calculating. The silence that fell when they saw me was complete, as if a curtain had dropped. Raquel's gasp ended in a shriek, and Javier's documents skittered to the floor in a sudden panic. Patricia crowed something about ghosts and cremation, while Alvin's face drained. Those first seconds were precious, the shock, the unspooling of their facade. Maria Elena's camera caught the entire tableau as I stepped forward and said simply, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Then we played their recorded voices, the car conversation, the cafe, plotting Alvin saying he'd expected the windfall. I watched as their faces contorted through stages, denial, horror, then thinly veiled anger. When the police moved in with plain, unstoppable authority, cuffs glinting like punctuation marks, I felt an odd, steady calm. They read the count's conspiracy to commit murder insurance fraud solicitation. For a moment, I watched my son, the boy who once practiced tying ties in the mirror for mock interviews, and I felt a grief that was not raw, but settled into a deep, precise sorrow. He turned to me with an expression I had once known, the pleading eyes of a child. "Mom, please," he mouthed, but he had no words that could reach across the chasm of what he had planned and nearly executed. As they led them away, the media swarmed. A torrent of cameras and microphones turned personal betrayal into public currency. I had thought carefully about whether this would humiliate me, appearing to the world as a trickster who faked death to shame a family. But I realized then that humiliation belongs to those who deserve it. I had not staged a spectacle for vanity, I had staged accountability. The trial that followed was less dramatic than the reveal, but far weightier. Our recorded evidence, phone calls, hidden camera footage, would have been thrown out in some courts as entrapment. But the judge found it compelling, especially once experts corroborated the timing, the lender's correspondence, and Alvin's job loss records. The prosecution framed the story not as a melodrama of a vindictive mother, but as a methodical conspiracy built for greed. The jury listened with eyes that took in the timbre of voices, the cadence of laughter, the casual cruelty of those small moments captured on film. When the verdicts came back guilty on conspiracy, an attempted homicide, insurance fraud, and an array of financial crimes, I felt an odd exhaustion rather than triumph. The law had done its part. The rest would be reconstruction. In the months that followed, the public attention receded gradually, like a tide withdrawing to reveal a changed shoreline. My phone became both a nuisance and a bridge, offers for interviews, messages from women who had been exploited, letters from people who said my courage gave them permission to speak their own truth. The sale of the old house felt like closing a painful chapter. I used the funds to start a modest scholarship program for single mothers, something my hands and my past could serve. I donated much of what remained to a women's shelter and to local educational programs. As for Javier, the boy who had been my entire life, the man who had conspired to kill me, prison became his crucible. He wrote letters that were thin with regret and thick with the weight of consequence. His words, while earnest, could not repair what had been broken, nor could they restore trust. I answered once, cautiously, offering a measured note that acknowledged his apology without absolution. My life moved forward in a shape I had not expected, quieter, more intentional. I found new companions, women who had been betrayed and abandoned, who stitched their lives together in soup kitchens and book clubs and legal aid clinics. We formed our own family, one assembled from mutual respect rather than blood. In the garden of my new home, I planted perennials that will bloom each year without my hand, like memories that grow without demand. The injury of betrayal remains a thin scar, but it does not define me. I learned that to live fully is to allow grief its due, but not to let it be the sole architect of days. I learned that dignity does not depend on whether those we love choose it for us. And finally, I learned that sometimes the only way to survive a betrayal is to make it public, to let the light reach the rot. Truth cleanses. Secrecy preserves decay. The weeks after the sentencing were a blur of silence, broken by the occasional letter news clipping or phone call from someone who had heard my story. I would sit in the quiet of my new home, the walls still smelling faintly of fresh paint, and let the truth of my survival settle into my bones. For decades, my life had revolved around others' Robert. Before he died, Javier, as he grew Alvin whenever he demanded. Now, for the first time in 62 years, I was forced to ask myself who Lydia was when she was not serving someone else's dream. It was not an easy question. Some mornings, I woke with the hollow ache of grief, missing the son I thought I had, the boy whose small hand once clung to mine on the way to school. Other mornings, I felt a raw anger that made my hands tremble as I poured my coffee, the anger of a woman who realized she had been treated as a bank account rather than a mother. And still, there were days when I felt nothing at all, just a vast emptiness where family should have been. The world, however, would not let me disappear into that emptiness. Maria Elena's broadcast had turned me into an unlikely symbol, and letters began to arrive in stacks. Women who whispered of children who abandoned them after years of sacrifice. Men who had been robbed by siblings they trusted, elderly parents whose own heirs treated them like burdens. Their words carried a weight that mirrored my own pain, and in answering them, I found the first sparks of healing. I was not alone. My betrayal was unique in its details, but not in its essence. I donated much of my money, not because I wanted to erase it, but because I wanted to transform it. If wealth had been the poison my family craved, then I would use it as medicine for others. The scholarship I created for single mothers was my greatest act of defiance with every young woman who stepped into a college classroom. Because of those funds, I silently told Javier, "This is what sacrifice is meant to do, not to be hoarded or stolen, but to lift others." Life settled into a rhythm with Beatrice by my side. She was my anchor, the witness to both my despair and my rebirth. We spent evenings on her porch drinking tea, laughing at the absurdity that two elderly women had pulled off what some journalists called the most dramatic resurrection of the decade. Sometimes we laughed until tears rolled down our cheeks. Other times, the laughter faded, and we simply sat in silence, holding each other's presence as proof that loyalty still existed in a treacherous world. But not all wounds healed cleanly. 2 years after the trial, a letter arrived from Javier. His handwriting was shaky, as though prison had broken not only his spirit, but his hands. He apologized page after page, confessing to the greed, the pressure, the fear of failure that had driven him into Raquel's schemes. He begged me to believe that beneath the man who had plotted my death still lived the boy I had raised. I read those words again and again, waiting for anger to rise, but what came instead was a tired sadness. I responded once not to absolve him, but to tell him that forgiveness was not a gift I could give in one letter. "You will spend the rest of your life proving whether you deserve to be remembered as my son," I wrote. He never answered, and perhaps that silence was its own answer. Prison hardened Raquel, Alvin, and Patricia in different ways. Raquel divorced Javier within the first year, blaming him publicly for everything, though the recording showed her complicity. Alvin grew bitterer, sending venomous notes to relatives about how I had ruined his life. Patricia retreated into herself, refusing interviews and rarely speaking during appeals. The world forgot them quickly, as it forgets most criminals, but I carried their betrayal like a faint bruise that never quite disappeared. Still, I refused to let that bruise dictate the rest of my days. I built new traditions with my chosen family holidays, spent with neighbors and friends' dinners, that echoed with genuine laughter, not the hollow politeness of blood ties. I became a grandmother again, not through Javier's children who were placed with Raquel's parents, but through the young students I supported. They visited, brought me flowers, called me abuela, with warmth that healed places biology never could. Sometimes late at night I would sit by my window and think of the cliff I almost fell from, not a physical one, but the metaphorical edge where trust ends and betrayal begins. I had stood there pushed to the brink by those I loved most, and instead of falling, I had flown in an unexpected direction. That thought gave me comfort. Life had not ended with their betrayal. It had, in a twisted way, begun. And so my story ends, not with revenge, but with rebirth. I did not fake my death simply to shame my family. I did it to survive, to reclaim the years they tried to steal from me. And in surviving, I discovered a truth more valuable than any inheritance family is not written in blood, but in loyalty, in compassion, in the simple act of showing up when it matters most. To anyone listening who has ever felt abandoned by the people you trusted most, know this: you are not alone. You are not worthless. You are not defined by their betrayal. You can build a new family from the ground up, brick by brick, kindness by kindness. I am living proof that it is never too late to start again. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to like this video, share it so others may find hope, subscribe for more true stories, and leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from or to share your own journey. Together we create a circle of truth that no betrayal can break.